He was 9 years old, but by the time paramedics saw him, he weighed about as much as a toddler. 35 pounds, bones showing, skin marked by injuries no child should ever carry. His name was Davontae, and he didn't get the chance to become anything more than a headline. What shocked investigators even more was the home he lived in, an ordinary apartment in Arlington, Texas, and the two adults inside it. One would take a plea. The other would one day walk into the death chamber as the only woman Texas executed in the entire decade, and her name was Lisa Ann Coleman. But the story of how she got there, that was far more complicated than anyone expected. When detectives stepped into that apartment on July 26, 2004, they weren't prepared for what they found. The smell of infection hung in the air. Dirty blankets were thrown in piles. Rooms looked lived in, but somehow empty, like a space that was supposed to protect a child but hadn't for a long time. And then the autopsy brought everything into sharp focus. Tiny scars, not a handful, not dozens, but hundreds. Some faded, some fresh, some still open. Marks that suggested binding, infections that showed long-term neglect, and injuries that didn't match the stories they were hearing. It was clear something terrible had been going on behind closed doors. But the question that investigators couldn't shake was simple. How does a child disappear like this without anyone noticing? And that question led straight to Lisa. Years before her name ever reached the courtroom, Lisa Ann Coleman had already survived things most people never recover from. She was born into chaos, raised in a home where safety was a luxury and violence was normal. Foster care came early, followed by even worse placements. By the time she entered her teens, she'd already run through abuse, instability, and survival mode thinking. People who knew her as a child described her as closed off, guarded, carrying a kind of anger that never cooled. When she became an adult, the cycles continued. Unstable relationships, run-ins with the law, and a sense that she was shaped more by trauma than choice. Then she met Lisa Williams, the mother of Davontae. The two women became partners, forming a household that neighbors later described as private, quiet, and isolated. Most didn't even know a child lived there, and the ones who did couldn't explain why they almost never saw him. Behind the front door, a different world was forming, one driven by control, secrecy, and the belief that keeping the child hidden would keep questions away. But the reality was darker. Davontae's health was deteriorating fast. His growth stalled. His weight dropped. And the marks on his body told a story he couldn't speak out loud. By the summer of 2004, paramedics finally got called, but it was too late. When they lifted Davontae's small frame from the apartment, his condition forced an immediate investigation. Detectives quickly realized they weren't dealing with a single incident or a moment of panic. They were dealing with something long-term, something systematic, something that prosecutors would later call torture. But to push the case forward, they needed to understand the roles of both adults in the house. Marcella was the biological parent. Lisa was the partner, and the evidence tied both of them to the environment that ultimately took the child's life. Marcella, the mother, took a plea deal. Life in prison, no trial, no gamble, no waiting for a jury. But Lisa didn't. She went to trial insisting she wasn't the monster everyone said she was. Her attorneys leaned heavily on her past, the abandonment, the beatings, the childhood spent surviving everyone else's choices. They portrayed her not as a leader, but as a follower, someone who grew up learning the wrong lessons and never learned anything different. They argued she didn't intend to kill anyone. They even suggested that Davontae's death was a medical emergency, possibly aspiration, not intentional violence. But the medical examiner disagreed, and the prosecution wasn't buying the mitigation story. Prosecutors took a different angle, one that turned the entire case into a death penalty fight. They argued that what happened inside that apartment wasn't just abuse, it wasn't just neglect, it was kidnapping. That single word changed everything. In Texas, a murder becomes a capital murder, meaning eligible for the death penalty, if it happens during another felony. Kidnapping was the felony prosecutors locked onto. Their theory? Davontae had been restrained, isolated, kept out of sight, denied freedom of movement, and held under conditions where he couldn't escape. They didn't need a stranger abducting a child off the street. They needed proof he was restrained without consent. And the medical findings, the marks, the injuries, the malnutrition, gave them a foundation to build that argument. The defense pushed back hard. They said it was impossible to kidnap a child in his own home. They say the state twisted the law just to secure a death sentence. They called it overreach, manipulation, even a misinterpretation of the statute. They insisted that whatever happened inside that apartment, it wasn't captivity. But the prosecution argued otherwise and the jury listened. The kidnapping aggravator stuck, and with it, the prosecution moved for the highest punishment Texas had. It came down to one question. Was Lisa Coleman so responsible for what happened that she deserved to die for it?
During trial, the evidence was relentless. Photos, injury reports, expert testimony describing the progression of physical decline. The jury heard about food deprivation, untreated infections, and the way Davontae's body showed signs of being bound. They heard conflicting stories from Lisa about how the child got his injuries. And the more the prosecution laid out the timeline, the more the jury saw not a single moment of violence, but a pattern, a long-term pattern. Then came the punishment phase, the final step before deciding if the death penalty was appropriate. Mitigation specialists laid out Lisa's childhood in painful detail. They talked about the beatings she took, the neglect she survived, the trauma she carried, and the fact that she'd never been taught anything resembling healthy behavior. They described her as someone who lived her entire life in fear and chaos. They said she was shaped by abuse, not malice. But jurors rejected it. They didn't see a follower. They saw someone who had participated in a child's suffering. They saw someone who didn't stop it. And they saw someone who, in their view, chose the child's punishment over his safety. When the verdict came back, it wasn't ambiguous. Death. For the next 10 years, Lisa lived on Texas's death row, a place few women ever see. Her appeals hinged on the kidnapping aggravator. Her attorneys argued that the state had stretched the definition too far. They said the conviction was built on a legal technicality. They even raised concerns about bias, saying a black lesbian woman wasn't given the same benefit of doubt others might receive. Civil rights groups echoed the criticism, but court after court upheld the conviction. Federal judges reviewed the case and refused to overturn it. And eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. When that happened, Lisa's execution date became official, September 17, 2014. On the day she was scheduled to die, Lisa reportedly spent her final hours quietly. She received visitors, prayed, and ate her last meal, a simple one. She wrote short messages to close friends telling them she forgave everyone who had hurt her. She insisted she never meant to cause Davontae harm, and she refused to speak hatred toward the courts that condemned her. When the moment arrived, she was escorted into the chamber at the Huntsville unit, a small room with pale walls and a narrow bed. She laid down calmly. Witnesses watched as the IVs were placed. And when asked for final words, she said she loved her family, she hoped to find peace, and she wished blessings on everyone present. Within minutes, she was gone. Her execution reopened debates that still haven't settled. Was the kidnapping charge a fair interpretation of the law? Did her past make her less responsible, or did it show a cycle she never broke? Could the system have intervened earlier, long before tragedy hit the apartment and changed the lives of everyone involved? Advocates argue that the death penalty was used too aggressively. Others said justice was served. But one thing no one disputes is this. A child fell through every safety net that was supposed to protect him. And Lisa Coleman, shaped by a lifetime of violence, became the face of a case that proved how thin the line can be between survival and catastrophe. Today, people still argue over what the state should have done, with Lisa, with Marcella, with Davontae, and with the system that overlooked every warning sign. Texas continues to defend the legal decisions made. Activists continue to challenge the logic behind them. But the case leaves one final question in the air, a question bigger than the courtroom, bigger than the sentence, and bigger than the law itself. If a single legal label can turn a life sentence into a death sentence, what does that say about the way justice